In July 1946, the Hungarian government issued a banknote with a number so large it had never been printed on currency before. 100 quintillion pengő. That is a 1 followed by 20 zeros. The note was worthless before the ink dried. Prices in Budapest doubled every 15 hours. Workers demanded payment twice per day. Once at noon, once at 5. Because money lost half its value between morning and evening. Families burned banknotes for heating fuel. It was cheaper than buying wood. This was not the first time a currency died. It would not be the last. Slow fade to images of stacked gold bars, farmland, oil barrels. But here is what the history books rarely mention. Some families emerged from that chaos wealthier than before. What did they own that everyone else did not? Before you can understand what survives, you must first understand what dies. The word collapse conjures images of sudden catastrophe. Markets plunging, banks shuddering, chaos in the streets. But monetary death rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. It follows a pattern, a sequence, a predictable deterioration that unfolds in 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 is denial. In 1994, the citizens of Yugoslavia watched their dinar lose value, slowly at first, then with gathering speed. The government assured them the situation was temporary. Economic experts appeared on television explaining that adjustments were being made. People continued depositing their savings in banks, continued holding their salaries in local currency, continued believing that the institutions they trusted would protect them. By January 1994, the monthly inflation rate reached 313 million%. A loaf of bread that cost 1 dinar in the morning cost several million by nightfall. Workers who received their paychecks at 9 a.m. found them worthless by noon. The currency that generations had used to measure their lives, their labor, their futures, evaporated. Phase 2 is panic. When denial breaks, it breaks completely. The population suddenly recognizes what they refused to see. Bank runs begin. Store shelves empty. Neighbors who smiled yesterday now guard their supplies with suspicion. The social contract fractures along invisible lines that were always present but never acknowledged. In March 2013, the citizens of Cyprus woke to discover that the government had made a decision while they slept. Bank accounts above 100,000 euros would be seized. Not taxed, not frozen, but confiscated. To recapitalize failing banks. The term they used was bail-in. The meaning was simpler. Your savings now belong to someone else. Those who had trusted the banking system discovered that their trust was the product being sold. Phase 3 is reset. Every collapse eventually ends. Not through recovery, but through replacement. Old currencies are abandoned. New currencies are introduced. Zeros are removed from banknotes. The government announces that stability has returned. But the reset is not neutral. It is a massive transfer of wealth from those who held the old system, is promises to those who held something else. Consider what actually goes to zero during collapse. Currency goes to zero. Every fiat currency in history has either failed or is in the process of failing. The Confederate dollar, once accepted across the American South, became wallpaper and kindling within months of Appomattox. The lifetime savings of soldiers, merchants, and farmers dissolved. Bonds go to zero. The safe assets that financial advisors recommend are simply promises denominated in currency. When the currency fails, the promises fail with it. A bond paying 5% interest means nothing when inflation runs at 50% per month. Bank deposits go to zero, or rather they go to someone else. Cyprus proved what historians already knew. When institutions face extinction, they will sacrifice depositors to survive. Your account balance is not money in a vault. It is a number in a ledger controlled by people who do not prioritize your interests. Even stocks can betray you. During the Weimar hyperinflation, the German stock market rose dramatically in nominal terms. An investor checking their portfolio might have felt wealthy, but adjusted for purchasing power, the stock market lost over 90% of its real value. The numbers grew larger, the wealth grew smaller. This is the trap that captures most people. They measure wealth in units that are themselves collapsing. They count currency while currency dies. They trust institutions while institutions fail. They believe in systems while systems reset. But across every collapse in recorded history, from ancient Rome to modern Venezuela, certain assets refuse to follow currency into oblivion. These assets share common characteristics. They are tangible or transferable. They are valued across borders and across generations. They do not depend on governments or banks to maintain their worth. The first of these assets has protected wealth for over 5,000 years. It is older than any currency, older than any nation, older than any empire that has ever existed, and it begins deep underground. In the 2nd century AD, a Roman legionary earned approximately 300 denarii per year. But the truly valuable payments came in gold, the aureus, containing roughly 8 grams of pure gold. With 1 gold aureus, that soldier could purchase a high-quality toga, a pair of sandals, and a belt. The complete outfit of a respectable Roman citizen. 2,000 years later, 1 ounce of gold, approximately 3 aurae worth, still purchases a quality men's suit, dress shoes, and a belt. The empires rose and fell, the currencies came and went, the languages changed, the borders shifted, the religions transformed, the purchasing power of gold remained. This is not poetry, this is arithmetic. Gold holds value not because of tradition or sentiment, but because of properties that no government can replicate and no technology has replaced. It is scarce. All the gold ever mined in human history would fit in a cube roughly 22 meters per side. It is indestructible. It does not rust, corrode, or decay. It is divisible, portable, and universally recognized. Every attempt to replace gold with paper promises has eventually failed. Every government that has abandoned gold has eventually debased its currency. The pattern holds across 5 millennia of recorded history. When Saigon fell in April 1975, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese faced a terrible choice: stay and submit to the new regime, or flee with whatever they could carry. Those who fled by boat, the boat people, who would become one of the largest refugee crises of the 20th century, could bring almost nothing. Bank accounts were frozen, property was seized, paper currency was worthless outside Vietnamese borders. But gold was different. Families who had converted their savings into gold could sew thin sheets into clothing, hide coins in hollowed shoes, carry wealth invisibly across borders. When they arrived in refugee camps in Malaysia, Thailand, or Hong Kong, the gold could be exchanged for any currency on earth. It bought passage to America. It funded new businesses. It rebuilt lives. The families who trusted paper lost everything. The families who held gold started over. But gold carries a vulnerability that must be acknowledged. In 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 6102, requiring American citizens to surrender their gold coins, bullion, and certificates to the Federal Reserve. The penalty for non-compliance was a fine of up to $10,000, equivalent to over $200,000 today, and up to 10 years in prison. Most Americans complied. The gold was exchanged for paper dollars at $20.67 per ounce. 1 year later, the government revalued gold at $35 per ounce, an instant 40% theft from those who had obeyed the law. Confiscation is the risk that gold holders must understand. When governments become desperate, they reach for the most tangible wealth they can find. Yet even as governments warn their citizens against gold, they accumulate it themselves. Central banks around the world have been net buyers of gold since 2010. China, Russia, India, Turkey, nations positioning themselves for monetary uncertainty, have added thousands of tons to their reserves. They do not announce this loudly. They simply buy. When institutions with access to all financial instruments choose to hold gold, the message is clear. They do not trust the system they operate. Gold preserves wealth, but it cannot feed you. It cannot shelter you. It cannot generate income while you hold it. In the depths of collapse, when supply chains shatter and cities become dangerous, gold may be difficult to exchange for what you actually need. There is an asset older than gold itself, an asset that produces value rather than simply storing it, an asset that has determined who lives and who dies in every crisis since humans first settled the land. In the winter of 1847, ships loaded with grain departed from Irish ports bound for England. The cargo holds were full, the docks were efficient. The exports continued on schedule. Meanwhile, 1 million Irish men, women and children starved to death within sight of those departing ships. This was the Great Famine. And it revealed a truth that every collapse confirms. Those who own productive land eat. Those who do not own land depend on the mercy of those who do. The Irish peasants worked the land. They planted the crops. They harvested the grain. But they owned nothing. The landlords, many of whom had never set foot in Ireland, collected rents, exported food, and watched from comfortable distances as their tenants died. The land did not fail. The system of ownership determined who survived. When General Douglas MacArthur assumed control of occupied Japan in 1945, he faced a nation where 70% of farmers were tenants, not owners. Wealth concentration in land had created a rural underclass with no stake in stability. The American occupation implemented radical land reform. Absentee landlords were forced to sell. Tenant farmers received the opportunity to purchase the land they had worked for generations. Within 5 years, owner-cultivated farmland increased from 54% to 90%. The land itself did not change. The same soil grew the same rice. But the redistribution of ownership transformed Japan's social structure and laid foundations for economic recovery. The lesson was clear. Land ownership survives regime change. The identity of the owner may shift, but productive land continues producing. Yet ownership is never permanent. In 2000, the Zimbabwean government began seizing white-owned commercial farms for redistribution. Within a decade, agricultural output collapsed. A nation that had exported food became dependent on international aid. The farms that had fed millions fell into disrepair. The land remained. The productivity vanished. Not because soil changed, but because the knowledge, capital, and infrastructure that made it productive were driven away. The Soviet Union learned this lesson decades earlier when Stalin's collectivization campaign destroyed the kulaks, the class of prosperous peasants who understood how to farm efficiently. The state seized their land, production plummeted, famine followed. Land without knowledge is merely dirt. Productive agricultural land requires the combination of ownership, expertise, and the stability to cultivate across seasons and years. For those seeking collapse-resistant assets, productive land offers what gold cannot: ongoing yield. A farm produces food regardless of what currency exists. It provides shelter regardless of which government holds power. It generates value through natural processes that no central bank can print or debase. But land carries a fundamental limitation. It cannot move. When borders close and jurisdictions turn hostile, land becomes a trap rather than a refuge. You cannot carry a farm across a checkpoint. You cannot hide acreage in your clothing. In the chaos of collapse, there are assets more immediately essential than gold or land, assets that determine survival in the first desperate weeks. Assets measured not in ounces or acres, but in calories and kilowatts. On October 17, 1973, the Arab members of OPEC announced an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. Within weeks, the price of crude oil quadrupled. Americans, who had never thought about energy, suddenly thought about nothing else. Gas stations ran dry, fistfights erupted in fuel queues. The Nixon administration imposed rationing, speed limits, and daylight saving time extensions. Anything to reduce consumption. The embargo lasted 5 months. The psychological impact lasted a generation. Those who controlled oil controlled everything. Those who depended on oil discovered the true nature of their vulnerability. When the Lebanese pound collapsed in 2020, losing over 90% of its value within months, the nation discovered which assets actually mattered. Bank accounts became inaccessible, frozen by institutions desperately preventing total collapse. Savings denominated in pounds evaporated. The professional class that had trusted the banking system watched decades of work disappear. But generators kept running. In a nation where the electrical grid provided only a few hours of power daily, private generators had long supplemented the failing infrastructure. When the currency collapsed, generator owners became the new essential class. They charged in dollars, real dollars, not Lebanese pounds, and those who could pay maintained refrigeration, lighting, and communication. Diesel fuel became more valuable than bank balances. Those who had stockpiled energy had leverage. Those who had trusted paper had darkness. Venezuela demonstrated the opposite lesson. Possessing commodities means nothing if you cannot convert them to survival. The nation sits atop the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. Yet by 2018, Venezuelans were losing an average of 11 kilograms of body weight per year. Hyperinflation destroyed the currency. Mismanagement destroyed the infrastructure. Oil wealth existed on paper while children starved in hospitals. Commodities must be accessible, usable, and convertible. A barrel of oil buried in the ground means nothing to a family that cannot buy bread. When the Austrian krone collapsed after World War I, the cities starved while the countryside ate. Urban professionals, lawyers, professors, bureaucrats discovered that their sophisticated skills could not be eaten. They traded family heirlooms for potatoes. They exchanged wedding rings for flour. The farmers who had been dismissed as peasants became the new aristocracy. Those who controlled food controlled survival itself. The pattern repeats. In every collapse, the hierarchy of needs reasserts itself with brutal clarity. Energy, food, water, shelter. Those who possess these essentials or can produce them hold power independent of any currency or government. But commodities share a limitation with land. They are difficult to transport across borders when borders close. What happens when you must flee? When staying means imprisonment or death? There is an asset that travels invisibly, an asset that crosses borders without inspection, an asset that exists beyond the reach of any government. In 1936, a Jewish banker in Berlin named Max Warburg faced a decision that would determine whether his family survived the coming decade. The signs were unmistakable. Nuremberg laws had stripped Jews of citizenship. Businesses were being confiscated. The noose was tightening with each passing month. Many of his peers hesitated. They had built their lives in Germany. Their wealth was in German banks, German properties, German investments. Leaving meant abandoning everything. Warburg understood what they did not. Wealth inside a hostile jurisdiction is not wealth at all. It is a hostage. He transferred assets abroad. He established accounts in neutral countries. When he finally fled in 1938, he carried not suitcases of cash, but knowledge of where his wealth waited safely beyond Nazi reach. Those who delayed, who believed the situation would improve, who trusted German institutions, lost everything. Many lost their lives. The pattern repeated 40 years later in Iran. When the Islamic Revolution overthrew the Shah in 1979, wealthy Iranians faced instant asset destruction. Bank accounts were frozen, properties were seized, businesses were nationalized. But the Iranian diaspora that rebuilt in Los Angeles, London, and Dubai shared a common characteristic. They had diversified before the revolution made diversification impossible. Those who had trusted the stability of the Pahlavi regime, who kept their wealth entirely within Iranian jurisdiction, became refugees with nothing. Those who had quietly moved assets abroad arrived in exile with the resources to rebuild. The window for moving wealth always closes before people expect it to close. Argentina's Corralito proved that even democracies confiscate. In December 2001, facing economic collapse, the Argentine government froze all bank accounts. Citizens could not withdraw their own money. When the freeze lifted and the peso was devalued, dollar-denominated accounts were forcibly converted to pesos at rates that erased 2/3 of their value. The middle class was wiped out. Not by hyperinflation, but by a government deciding that private savings belonged to the state. Those who had moved dollars abroad, to Uruguay, to Miami, to Switzerland, preserved their wealth. Those who had trusted Argentine banks learned that trust was misplaced. Switzerland built its entire financial identity on one principle: jurisdictional sanctuary. During World War II, while Europe burned, Swiss francs held value. Swiss banks, whatever their moral compromises, provided a place where wealth could wait out catastrophe. Today, Singapore serves a similar function for Asian wealth seeking stability beyond local politics. The principle is timeless. Assets beyond borders are assets beyond reach. But there is a final asset that requires no bank, no vault, no account number. An asset that crosses every border invisibly. An asset that cannot be frozen, seized, or devalued by any government on earth. It exists entirely between your ears. When Fidel Castro consolidated power in Cuba, he nationalized everything the wealthy had accumulated. Factories were seized, estates were confiscated, bank accounts were emptied. The Cuban elite who had trusted their prosperity to property and paper lost it all within months. But the doctors, the engineers, the skilled tradespeople who fled to Miami carried something that could not be nationalized. The ability to create value from nothing but knowledge and effort. Within a generation, Cuban exiles had built one of the most prosperous immigrant communities in American history. They arrived with empty pockets and full minds. Their skills translated across borders, across languages, across economic systems. The mansions they abandoned in Havana crumbled under state management. The human capital they carried rebuilt fortunes in a foreign land. In August 1972, Idi Amin gave Uganda's Asian population 90 days to leave the country. Approximately 80,000 people, merchants, professionals, factory owners who had built East Africa's commercial infrastructure over generations, were expelled with whatever they could carry. Assets were seized, businesses were confiscated, life savings evaporated. They arrived in Britain, Canada and India as refugees with nothing. Within 10 years, Ugandan Asians in Britain had higher average incomes than the native population. Within 20 years, they had produced millionaires, members of parliament, and leaders in medicine, law, and commerce. Amin had stolen their property. He could not steal their expertise, their work ethic, their commercial instincts. The skills that had built prosperity in Uganda built greater prosperity elsewhere. When Soviet tanks crushed the Hungarian Revolution in November 1956, approximately 200,000 Hungarians fled westward. Among them were engineers, scientists, mathematicians, and technicians. The educated class that recognized totalitarianism offered no future. Western nations competed to accept them, not from charity, but from recognition. These refugees carried skills that would strengthen any economy that welcomed them. Hungarian refugees founded technology companies, led university departments, and contributed to innovations from nuclear physics to computer science. Their flight was Hungary's loss and the West's gain. Singapore understood this arithmetic from its founding. A city-state with no natural resources, Singapore built prosperity entirely on human capital, attracting and developing skilled workers from across the globe. Today it offers one of the world's most competitive immigration pathways for professionals and entrepreneurs. The lesson is explicit. Skills travel. Skills compound. Skills cannot be confiscated, frozen, or inflated away. The question is not which skills matter. Medical, technical, mechanical, agricultural, but whether you possess skills that create value independent of any single system. When currencies die and institutions fail, those who can do things survive. Those who merely manage things discover their obsolescence. But no single asset is sufficient. Gold can be confiscated. Land cannot move. Commodities run out. Foreign accounts can be frozen. Even skills require a destination that values them. The true strategy of survival requires something more sophisticated. Combination. In the winter of 1917, the Russian aristocracy learned what happens when you store all your wealth in a single jurisdiction. The Romanovs and their circle possessed land, millions of acres of the richest soil in Europe. They held gold and jewels accumulated over centuries. They owned palaces, factories, and financial instruments beyond counting. None of it saved them. The land was seized. The bank accounts were frozen. The gold that remained in Russian vaults was confiscated. Those who stayed were executed, imprisoned, or reduced to poverty. The glittering wealth of Imperial Russia vanished within months, but some survived. The aristocrats who had diversified, who had deposited funds in Paris banks, purchased properties in Nice, established accounts in London, emerged from revolution with resources intact. They had not trusted the permanence of any single system. Prince Felix Yusupov, one of Russia's wealthiest men, had moved enough assets abroad that he lived comfortably in exile for decades. Others who had been equally wealthy but entirely Russian in their holdings died in poverty or before firing squads. The difference was not total wealth, the difference was allocation. The Weimar hyperinflation created a natural experiment in survival strategies. Families who held only currency, savings accounts, bonds, pensions, were annihilated. A lifetime of careful accumulation became worthless within months. The professional class that had trusted the German mark discovered their trust was a form of suicide. Families who held only gold fared better but faced challenges. Gold preserved purchasing power but could not generate income. In the chaos of 1923, converting gold to daily necessities meant exposure to criminals and informants. Families who held only land could eat but could not easily acquire medicine, manufactured goods or services that required cash transactions. The families who navigated Weimar successfully shared a common profile. They held multiple asset classes in deliberate combination. Some gold for concentrated portable wealth, some productive land for food security and ongoing yield, relationships with farmers and tradespeople who could provide essential commodities, where possible accounts or assets beyond German borders, and skills, practical abilities that could generate income regardless of what currency existed. No single asset was sufficient. The portfolio was the strategy. The principle translates across every collapse in history. Gold provides density, maximum wealth in minimum space, portable across borders when movement is possible. Land provides production, ongoing yield that does not depend on financial systems, security when remaining in place is viable. Commodities provide immediate survival. The essentials that matter in the first desperate weeks when systems fail. Foreign assets provide optionality. Wealth beyond the reach of local catastrophe. Resources waiting in stable jurisdictions. Skills provide regeneration, the ability to rebuild from zero when everything else is lost. The question is not which asset is best. The question is which combination matches your circumstances, your risks, your ability to act. But strategy means nothing without timing. When should you shift from accumulation to protection? When does prudent preparation become urgent necessity? The warning signs are not hidden, they are flashing now. And history suggests the window closes faster than anyone expects. The British pound sterling was once what the dollar is today. For over a century, from the Napoleonic Wars until the mid-20th century, the pound served as the world's reserve currency. International trade was denominated in sterling. Central banks held their reserves in pounds. The phrase, safe as the Bank of England, was not metaphor. It was global consensus. Then came 2 world wars. Britain borrowed massively to finance the conflicts. Debt accumulated beyond sustainable levels. The industrial base that had made Britain workshop of the world declined relative to rising competitors. By 1945, Britain owed more than it could ever repay through normal economic activity. The transition from pound to dollar did not happen overnight. It unfolded across decades. A slow erosion of confidence, a gradual shift in reserve holdings, a creeping recognition that the old order had passed. By 1956, when Britain attempted to assert imperial authority during the Suez Crisis, the Americans simply threatened to sell their sterling reserves. Britain backed down within days. The power had shifted. The world acknowledged what the numbers already showed. Reserve currency status, once lost, does not return. Today, global debt exceeds $307 trillion. The United States alone carries over $34 trillion in federal debt, more than 120% of GDP. Interest payments now consume over $1 trillion annually, competing with defense spending for budgetary dominance. But America is not unique. Europe staggers under its own obligations. Japan's debt exceeds 260% of GDP. China's property sector has accumulated liabilities that dwarf the subprime crisis. The entire global financial system runs on debt that can never be repaid through productive economic activity. It can only be serviced through more borrowing or through the quiet theft of inflation. Meanwhile, the nations outside the Western financial order are preparing alternatives. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their expanding membership now represents over 40% of global population and roughly 35% of global GDP. They are building payment systems that bypass the dollar. They are accumulating gold at rates not seen in generations. They are negotiating trade agreements denominated in local currencies. De-dollarization is not theory. It is policy. History does not repeat exactly. But the warning signs of systemic crisis have remained consistent across centuries. Warning sign 1. Debt exceeds the capacity to service it. When interest payments consume ever larger portions of revenue, whether for governments, corporations, or households, the mathematics eventually become impossible. Every percentage point of rising rates accelerates the reckoning. Warning sign. 2. Currency debasement accelerates. When central banks must create money to purchase debt that markets will not buy, the endgame approaches. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet expanded from under $1 trillion in 2008 to nearly $9 trillion by 2022. The trajectory has one destination. Warning sign. 3. Social trust collapses. When populations no longer believe their institutions serve them, when faith in elections, in courts, in media, in financial systems falls below critical thresholds, the legitimacy that holds systems together begins to fracture. Warning sign. 4. Wealth concentration reaches extreme levels. When the gap between those who own assets and those who depend on wages becomes a chasm, when young generations recognize they will never achieve what their parents took for granted, the social contract dies. Warning sign 5. The middle class disappears. When the broad, stable center of society that anchors democracy and commerce shrinks toward irrelevance, when people divide into those who have everything and those who have nothing, the conditions for rupture are complete. Check these indicators against present reality. Draw your own conclusions. Remember the Hungarian pengő. 100 quintillion units of currency, a number most people cannot comprehend, printed on a single note that could not purchase a loaf of bread. The people who held those notes had worked for that money. They had saved it. They had trusted the system that issued it. They followed every rule, made every prudent decision their society recommended, and they lost everything. Not because they were foolish, not because they were lazy, because they held assets denominated in promises that could not be kept. The 5 assets detailed in this film are not secrets. Gold has preserved wealth for 5,000 years. Productive land has fed humanity since the first settlements. Essential commodities have determined survival in every crisis. Foreign diversification has saved countless families from jurisdictional catastrophe. Portable skills have rebuilt fortunes from nothing across every generation. The knowledge is available. The historical evidence is overwhelming. The pattern has never been broken. Yet most people will watch this, agree with this logic, and do nothing. They will assume the collapse happens elsewhere. They will believe there is still time. They will trust that someone, governments, institutions, experts, will prevent the worst. This is the normalcy bias that destroys wealth in every generation. The Hungarian families who held gold in 1946 did not know the exact date the pengő would die. The Russian aristocrats who diversified before 1917 did not know revolution was imminent. They simply understood that systems fail, currencies die, institutions betray, and they prepared before preparation became impossible. The window is still open. The question is not whether you understand the pattern. The question is whether you will act while acting remains a choice.